Howdy bubs and welcome back. Today we're going to be jumping into GameMaker to get started on our first project for video game programming. So, those of you that are familiar with GameMaker should be familiar with this whole setup, but for those of you that are not, I'm going to go ahead and quickly dive into some basic introduction to the interface and how we will use it in the class. So, starting off, you should make a new project. You're going to click Game if it hasn't already been selected, and a blank game. Name this something appropriate for whatever you're trying to do. I'm just going to call this Zombie Survival. That's going to be the theme I'm going to be going for. Alright, we're in the IDE. I'm going to go ahead and get started with creating my sprite. Right click, create, and go to sprite. And I'm going to call this SPR underscore, and this will be my player. I'm going to make sure my origin is in the center, and I'm going to create a beautiful box. My player is done. This is going to be a placeholder. We're going to change this at some point in the future, but the future is not now, and so we're going to keep it as a box. When getting started with your projects, leave all of the fancy sprite art for later, or do that before everything even gets started. But the point is, while working on the code, try to avoid going back and forth between your sprite and your code, as you may likely fall behind as we go through the coursework. We'll have plenty of time at the end to go into all the details that you want. Now that we have saved this, let's go back to our workspace. And I'm going to create our player object. So right click, object, and it's going to be obj player. Moving down in here, I'm using middle mouse button to quickly traverse the workspace. Over here, I'm going to make sure I select my player sprite. Now we have an assigned sprite to our player object. And the object is where we're going to start placing in all of our code. I'm going to demonstrate two ways to have movement for your player. There is the simpler way of using just the key events, and then the slightly more complicated way, but going into more detail and giving you more control, is using the step event. First, I will use the key events. So I'm going to use a key down event. Key down is specifically whenever I click and hold. A key pressed event is you have to press and release for it to be triggered. And key up is only on the release. So since I want to be able to press and then hold it down to facilitate movement, I will do a key down event. So once you click on the event, I clicked key left, and so I was referencing key down on the left arrow key. It'll ask what language you're going to do. You're going to do GameMaker language code. Don't ask again for this project. Don't ask again ever, for convenience sake. Now we're here. So whenever I press the left arrow key and hold it down, I want something to happen. So I can put my little details in my comment of what this is going to do. So this is the description portion, and just say move left. So whenever I press the left arrow key, I'm going to modify our current X position and set this equal to be X minus 5 pixels. So now whenever I press the left arrow key, the player object in the room should move left 5 pixels. Its X position changes by 5. By -5 specifically. I can add an additional event. Key down, right. And this will be moved right. And I can specify X will be equal to X plus 5. And there we go. And then the next two, common sense, up, down, and as you might imagine, we will be modifying not the X, but instead the y values here. But what you might not know, unless you've taken the previous class, is whenever modifying the y values, the axis is actually flipped. Positive y does not go up, positive y goes down. So if I'm moving up, I must actually subtract from my y value, and if I'm moving down, I must add to my y value. Now we have a nice set of values in place for our player and the 4 events to address the up, down, left, and right movements. But if I'm going to hit run at this moment, nothing's going to happen. At least nothing meaningful. I can demonstrate it. Our project is going to be built, and I'm met with a blank screen. There's nothing in here. We must address this by going into our room and adding in our player object. Now, whenever I hit play, the room will now show the player. I can then use the up, down, left, and right keys to move around in my world. I'm also going to add in how to do rotation using the same key event structure. We're going to go ahead and add another key event. We're going to do key down, and in this case I'm going to do the letters Q and E. So if I press the letter Q, I'm going to rotate, in this case Q, I want it to go counterclockwise. And so that would mean we would use, in this case, image underscore angle references the angle of our sprite. And I'm going to increase it for us to go counterclockwise. That is to go from this position and rotate this point upward. That would be adding to our degrees. The shorthand form of doing the, in this case, x is equal to x minus 5. This would be image angle is equal to image angle plus 5 plus 10, whatever degrees we use. The shorthand form of that would be plus equals. We can now say image angle is plus equals. Let's do 10 degrees. And we can duplicate this event and change it to be a key down with the letter E. Here this will be clockwise, and this will be minus equals. Now let's go ahead and check the room. You always want to confirm that your code does work, and so pressing Q, I'm rotating counterclockwise. If I press E, I'm now rotating clockwise. And I can hold it down, it spins, same thing for the other direction. Arrow keys to move me, and I can spin and move simultaneously. But this is only one way that you can do movements. A way that you can condense all of these events down would be using the step event. Let's go ahead and jump in here. So in this step event, we can specify, in this case, I'm going to have movement and rotation. So let's go ahead and do movement. In this case, I'll do if keyboard check, and in this case, keyboard check. We're going to just see if something is being held down, and I will specify, I want to use WASD for my movement now. So unfortunately, to do any of the letters on the keyboard in this format, you have to use ORD, and if I select W, we first are looking for where the W key, after getting converted into a number, to see if it is being held down. If this is the case, then I want Y to be updated by going up or minus 5 pixels. And you can actually Copy this whole thing and repeat. For S, this will be plus 5. A, this will be X minus 5. And D, this will be X plus 5. Now let's go ahead and test to confirm that this works. W moves us up, S moves us down, A moves us left, and D moves us right. I can actually press both, so if I'm pressing A and left, my movement speed is actually doubled. Generally, you don't want to have both of these options active. You want to do one or the other. If I press the right arrow key or D, then I move 5 pixels. If you have them separated like I currently have coded, they will both stack on top of each other. Because if I press D, I move to the right by 5 pixels every step. Or if I press the right arrow key, I move towards the right by 5 pixels. They both trigger, and so I'm moving twice as fast. Just be aware of that. And Q and E still work out just fine. You can also implement movement using a controller. The controller code requires a little bit more in-depth explanation that goes beyond the scope of what I have envisioned, and most of y'all would have to bring your own controllers, as I only have a personal controller. So I'm not going to cover it here in my videos, but if you just look up GameMaker game controller implementation, they have an official, very nicely put together instruction set. I would recommend you looking at that for adding in the controller. Otherwise, this covers everything relevant to player movement, at least as far as we are concerned at the moment. We now know how to use the key down events. We now know how to use the step events to facilitate movement and turning. Make sure whenever you create this that you decide whether you want to use the key down or the step event rather than both, or modify your code such that you have either option. Here's a slight addendum to our movement. One thing that you might be interested in is ensuring that the player doesn't just roll off of the map endlessly, because if I just press W and keep going, then my player will just eventually go off the map and keep going outside of our room. You have two choices on how you can address this. You can implement move wrapping, so that way as I move to the left, it pops over onto the right side. Or you can clamp the player inside of the room space. So let's take a look at how to achieve this. In the case of wrapping, you can simply use the command move wrap and specify true for horizontal wrapping, true for vertical wrapping, and by how many pixels must your object go out of the room for it to trigger. In this case, I'm going to reference the sprite underscore width, and I'm going to say once half of the sprite has left the room, trigger it. So now if I hit this, if I move towards the left and go halfway off, I pop over to the right. Same thing with going down, up, and right. And there you go. That's as simple as that for doing room wrapping. Now, if instead you wanted to trap the player, you would have to use clamp. In this case, I'll comment this out, Control K, and then we're going to see how to clamp the player inside the room. Again, this is after all your movements have been done. That X must be inside clamp. It forces the value between them. Our X value gets updated to be something between 0 and the room underscore width. Y similarly is going to be clamped between 0 and the room underscore height. Now if I hit run, if I try to go up, I'm trapped. If I try to go left, I'm trapped. Down, trapped, and again to the right, I am trapped. What it uses to determine how far we have gotten is actually our origin point, which is why I had mentioned before try to center it, and so that way we can get as far as the center where our origin is before we are trapped inside of the boundaries. As X and Y refer to the origin point of your object. So at your choice which of these you'd like to implement, it is ultimately up to you. You do have to implement one of them. You cannot just endlessly go into the void. Either implement clamp or implement move wrap. Otherwise, that's all I've got. If you have any questions or need any assistance, just let me know. Everyone, have a good one. I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my bad bubs, my top 5, my day ones. Y'all have always been there for me. Next up, my baby bubs, the next 5. I always love y'all's support. And finally, for everyone else, any little bit helps. Thank you to all my basic bubs for supporting me along my journey. If you want to continue receiving notifications, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell button.